All right, good afternoon, everybody. From lockdown but sunny Cambridge. My name is Tuba Basran, if you haven't met me yet. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for the Study of Global Human Movement at the University of Cambridge. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all. I will have to do two functions here, so please bear with me. I will have to manage the meeting technically and at the same time talk to you. As I said, it's a pleasure to welcome you all to our first session of the series, Global Conversations, Frontlines during COVID-19. In this series, we would like to explore how COVID-19 affects the situation of refugees and migrants across different parts of the globe and what we can expect for the post-COVID governance. Herefore, what we're hoping to do is to engage in conversations with people at the front lines in Europe, the Middle East, and North America. We will host these sessions every fourth night. So today we will start with exploring the situation of migrant workers in the Gulf region with a focus on coping and survival strategies of migrant workers during COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on migration governance in the Gulf region. I am delighted and honored to introduce Mr. Froilan Malit, Jr. Mr. Malit is a Gulf migration specialist at the Gulf Labor Markets and Migration and the Managing Director of Rights Corridor, a regional news platform and research on migration and rights issues. Over the past decade, Mr. Malit has lived and worked across the Gulf region, working as technical and migration policy consultant for a number of regional and international organizations, including the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, ILO, and IOM. He is also an advisory committee member for the ILO Regional Office for Arab States Migration Advisory Group and the Center for Global Development's Labor Mobility Project. He holds degrees from Cornell at the University of Oxford and a migration certificate from the European University Institute. He is currently studying international relations at the University of Cambridge. So a few points to the rules of engagement before I start out. To ensure that all participants can get the most out of today's talk, there are a few points. Please keep yourselves muted. During the conversation, we'll start with a short interview with Mr. Malit. If you have any questions or observations you would like to share, please use the chat function, and we will collect all the comments, questions, and share these with Froilan. And possibly, depending on how this goes, we could also you could also raise your hands if that's possible with a digital hand. So let me just start out immediately. Mr. Malit, Froilan, would you be able to start out with a few words on the migrant populations in the Gulf region? General information, a short introduction about where they're from, what jobs do they take on, etc., for all of those of us who are not very much acquainted with the Gulf region and the migrant workers there.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes,
okay, you can hear me perfectly, right? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Dr. Chugba and the Center for having me today. So the Gulf region, so it's a very dynamic, migrant destination. Again, it's actually the largest, non-Western migrant destination globally, and the region has about 51 million population, and 51%, roughly 29 million, are actually migrant workers. And if you unpack sort of that data, you can clearly see that 70% of these migrant workers, they're based either in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE. Now, if you look at the migrant population relative to the local population, there are some GCC countries where migrants have outnumbered the local population. So that includes the UAE, where 87% are actually migrant workers, Qatar, 87%, Kuwait, 69%, Bahrain, 54%. Now, countries like Oman and Saudi, locals still outnumber the migrant population, but Saudi actually has the largest number of migrant workers, just 12 million. Now, that includes actually, undocumented migrant workers and those who've overstayed their visas. Now, sectorally speaking, a lot of these migrant jobs within the Gulf are ethnically segmented based on certain sectors, partly because of the preference, from the Gulf states. So if you look at domestic work, the majority of people who are working in these sectors are Filipinos, Indonesians, Indians, specifically for Indian nationals, and a lot of migrants from Africa, specifically Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. For construction work, majority are South Asians from India and Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, specifically with respect to the recent Qatar World Cup, a lot of the mega infrastructure projects that they're building. For hospitality, it's actually mixed of Arab nationals and Asians, specifically, again, Filipinos, Indians, Egyptians. For doctors and nurses, a lot of Filipinos as nurses and Indian nationals, and some from Pakistan. For Arabs, a lot of Palestinians and Egyptians, and a lot of Westerners, specifically from the UK and the United States. For teachers, a lot of Arab nationals as well, and a lot of the secondary assistant teachers are actually Filipinos. Now, if you look at the racial breakdown of the Gulf, 90% actually comes from South Asia. So India is actually the largest migrant population here. Now, if you look at the spread of different nationalities, for example, South Asians, they dominate a lot of sectors, and they outnumber a lot of other migrants in each Gulf country. So, for example, in the UAE and Saudi, Indians dominate the figures in terms of the proportion and share. And in the case of Indonesians, a lot of them, 90% of them are actually concentrated in Saudi Arabia. Filipinos across the board, but mostly in Saudi and UAE. Now, the region is very interesting because it remits $100 billion remittances. So a lot of this money gets recycled, in Asia, in Arab states, and other countries beyond that. And rights groups basically frame the region in the context of, precariousness that a lot of Gulf countries have, slow legal reform, specifically linked to kafala, and that despite all the reforms that they've conducted or implemented in the past, the lack of social protections have really heightened a lot of tension, especially at this, moment in time with the rise of COVID pandemic in the Gulf region. But a lot of countries too, and a lot of researchers also highlighted that if you compare the Gulf regions now and 10 years before, the Gulf countries have actually instituted a lot of excellent policy reforms to regulate the market. Now, rights groups are saying those reforms often lack in terms of the policy implementation processes. So again, I guess like for the initial questions that you asked, Dr. Tubba, those are the kind of dynamics that you see, right? Because what happens is high share of migrant populations could lead to high risks, right, for the states, and high risks as well for sending states and for migrants. So I think I'd like to unpack some of those, as we move forward. So yeah.
What would be like the key 3 problems that migrant workers are facing? Pre-COVID stage. Let's start with the pre-COVID stage and then move to the COVID stage and then the post-COVID stage, maybe.
Absolutely. I think migrant workers in the Gulf have faced differential, types of problems. It depends on different sectors, because certain migrant, concentration in certain sectors like domestic work and construction often lead to different degrees of precariousness versus those who work in the private sector. Those who work within the domestic confines of employers' households, they tend to be more in a precarious situation relative to others. But if you look at more broadly, the key issues, as well as how interregional consultative dialogues, such as the Abu Dhabi Dialogue and the Colombo process, have identified these issues. So I could highlight 5 issues here. One is issues related to unethical or illegal recruitment processes. That's, again, linked to debt bondage, excessive fees paid by workers, even though the international says no recruitment costs for workers. Issues related to public health So it's kind of linked to living and working conditions. A lot of them will actually live in migrant industrial camp spaces. So these are the current issues that you see being highlighted in The Guardian and a lot of international newspapers. Working conditions, specifically linked to mobility constraints, not being able to transfer from one employer to another. Issues related to discrimination and overwork, specifically domestic workers, where the average working hours is between 14 to 16 hours across the Gulf. Now, the fourth one is actually access to justice. So the lengthy bureaucratic procedure in terms of gaining that legal verdict, which often takes 2-3 months. So if you file a case, you're more likely to give up because there's really no point of filing. I mean, if it takes too long, because here in the Gulf, the moment you file a case, you lose your job. And not like in Europe where you can reinstate, your unpaid wages, etc. It's slightly different here. So the moment you file a case, the moment you lose your job. So there's also issues related to dispute resolutions as well, non-payment. And I've worked in the Philippine Embassy in Qatar 8 years ago, and I still work with a lot of attachés. It's the same issue that you see here. The point that I'm making here is that, so these critical issues are happening, but it's also critical to look at how they are being, the differential issues, right, within the country. Because I think it's not fair to lump them all together and say, oh, they're all abusers, But I think it's also, or violators. I think it's really interesting to look at the efforts that are being conducted too within across the region and sort of, in each like Gulf country and how they've been doing it in the past. So I think these are the issues in the past, Dr. Tuba, that have led and even sort of that have been amplified even more so now with the current context.
And you're currently in Dubai, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Right.
Doing my field work.
So how is it at the moment in Dubai? I mean, that would be, I suppose a lot of us are very much interested in understanding what the current restrictions are and what is the impact of this on the migrant workers. I understand you're still in touch with a number of the workers in the region also on a daily basis. What is the feedback that you're getting?
So in Dubai and across the Gulf countries, when COVID-19 proliferated across the region, the initial measure of the Gulf countries, were to implement a lot of domestic containment measures. So you can see a lot of lockdowns and curfews, sanitations, and that was really challenging partly because it created mass unemployment, specifically, across sectors in the Gulf countries. Now, if you look at the UAE in particular, the government was quite aggressive in terms of containing COVID-19. And remember, Dubai, just like Qatar and other countries, they rely heavily, from tourism industry, hospitality, manufacturing, etc. So aggravated by the low price of oil and the economic shutdowns that you see, it created massive impact on migrant workers. So what ended up happening was that a lot of workers, they became unemployed because they had to temporarily shut down these countries. Now, from a migrant level perspective, that's actually a big problem because a lot of these workers have transnational economic obligations to their families. Now, remittances are shut down, wages are low, and job opportunities are also scarce. Even the informal economy is actually not functioning. And a lot of migrants here and across the Gulf, specifically those undocumented workers, they, to an extent, or maybe a large extent, struggle to access medical care services. So different countries have different sort of instituted different reforms when it comes to healthcare to address the public health aspect of it. So in Kuwait, they passed the amnesty. So in Kuwait, if you're undocumented, there's no access for you for medical services. In Saudi, they passed that law stating that undocumented workers will also have the same equal access. In the UAE, there are charitable organizations and the government that has stated that they will also cover health packages specifically for undocumented workers. So I guess, because I know I'm giving a lot of details here, but what's happening in the context of migrant workers is that one, massive unemployment is happening. And this creates a lot of tension for the sending states and for migrant workers and their families. Public health concerns, specifically in those migrant industrial camps. So when the COVID occurred in the region, the initial reaction for a lot of Gulf states was to really contain and impose lockdown on these migrant industrial camps, partly because a lot of people live, for example, in one room. So there are 8 to 10 people living in the same space. So social distancing becomes impossible. So massive investments and massive priorities in terms of, hiring a lot of police officers to patrol these areas, a lot of health and safety campaigns that were also instituted. I'm not saying that these things weren't happening in the past, but I think the degree of attention, the degree of public health approach within their domestic policy schemes became even more intensified. The labor market, it's certainly a big challenge because it's no pay, no work. I mean, how are you going to say that to workers and their family members? I mean, you're talking about people with 5, 6 kids back home, right? For example, in the case of Filipinos, like, how are you going to say that? I mean, a lot of these kids, they do have, finances to pay. Kids are in high school or universities, or their parents are sick. So that sort of no pay, no court. I mean, that's actually very challenging. And more importantly, the issue of debt, because it's not possible for somebody in the Gulf to leave, the region without paying the debt. You have to pay your debt. When I say debt, I'm referring to personal loans, car loans. I'm also referring to business loans, or even from the loan sharks. And so a lot of them actually do have court cases, civil cases, criminal cases. Kuwait is an interesting case because Kuwait ended up allowing those people with non-criminal records to go into their amnesty initiative recently, which I will discuss quite later. But I think I want to add 2 more things very quickly, Dr. Tugba. The food and living conditions, right? So with the unemployment issue that a lot of migrants are facing, the biggest challenge at the moment is actually living conditions, right? A lot of them don't have savings. So they're focused now on paying the rent, because if you have a home, a place to stay, you can still survive. So they're not investing so much on food, they're investing so much actually on rent. And a lot of the landlords in the Gulf, some are very generous, so they give you discounts or they allow you to delay, but some actually are, not so nice, because they also have responsibility to these realtors. So it's quite complicated in that sense. And then the legal dispute too. Some employers don't want to pay, or not necessarily don't want to pay, but some actually want to pay, but others are struggling to pay their workers, partly because they run out of cash flow, specifically small and medium enterprises. So I was interviewing one of the employers, and what he basically told me is that, look, Froilan, it's very difficult for me to cancel migrant workers at the moment, because the moment I cancel them, then I have the responsibility to pay their gratuity, wages, tickets, and I don't have the cash flow at the moment. So as a result, you see this, surplus of labor floating in the market, unemployed. A lot of them their wages are partially deducted, and they operate within that no pay, no work scheme. So it's a struggle. So that's why there's a lot of humanitarian groups, local church groups, diaspora associations here offering different kinds of food. But the question is that, for how long can you do this, right? If you look at the cases, they're actually going up. And the more they go up, for how long can Gulf countries contain this, right? Contain and allow workers to stay. And for how long can workers also stay here, given that lack of savings and lack of other financial means to support themselves. I mean, a lot of them are still trying, for example, in Dubai. So there's a partial easing. Remember, it's Ramadan right now, right? So a lot of shops, majority are closed in the Gulf. Now, a lot of workers still try to work, part-time, because they believe that the part-time wages here are relatively much higher back home, right? And if they go home, I mean, what's there for them? Like, what's in it for them? There's no job opportunities there. They're also locked down. The costs are very high, and a lot of them, you know, they're not going to have, or they're not going to take that approach where they'll be there without the money, right? And I think that's very, very important to look at. So that degree of precariousness. So in the past, those things exist, but I think now, I think it has become even more intensified. But certain sectors are actually doing well. I mean, I could say the nursing industry, the medical sectors, they're doing well. So there are variations, but for the most part, it's a tough time, you know, because Gulf countries too invest a lot of money in terms of containing this. So they've lost a lot of businesses, a lot of, the economic sources that they would traditionally would have, and migrants as well. They've lost their jobs, and they're struggling. And a lot of the measures that are, you know, Gulf countries are approaching right now are the repatriation ones, which I will discuss very shortly. How are they coping with it, and for how long can they keep up, you know, with all these difficulties that they're facing?
Maybe if you could slightly touch upon the post-COVID governance and how do you think that is going to develop in the Gulf region? What is the impact of COVID on the general governance and on the right protection of migrant workers? How is that going to be? What do you think?
I think the Asia Gulf migration corridor in particular, the post-COVID migration governance it's going to require a lot of cooperation and a lot of genuine policy discussions, you know, on how to really move forward and incorporate the critical importance of public health and social protection in the Gulf context. So a lot of rights groups and a lot of policy sort of publications have consistently highlighted this. And I think facilitating sort of a labor mobility scheme, you know, legal labor mobility scheme. So the World Bank is doing this at the moment, the LAMP project, the Center for Global Development Studies. Now, I think I can see 5 things here, you know, that I think are quite worthwhile to explore. So what would it look like? Let me start with the skilled sector. I think in the medical sector, specifically nurses, there's going to be a lot of competition there. Massive shortages of nurses are happening here at the moment. And Europe, US, Canada, etc., they're also looking to get more nurses. The question for the Gulf countries is that how do you incentivize, you know, nurses to stay here? Currently, the wages are being offered double here, like in Abu Dhabi, for example, and even in Kuwait, in order for people to actually work in the nursing industry. But a lot of these nurses too, they want to, you know, they use the Gulf countries as a transit state for them. You know, a lot of them would prefer to be in the West. So I think that's an interesting question in terms of, you know, the opportunities for sending countries perhaps to negotiate a better deal, a better package for a lot of nurses. Could be higher wages or long-term, you know, permanent residency. Usually it's two years renewable contract, but perhaps a longer one similar to those investors, you know, in the Gulf countries. So I think the medical sector, given its, you know, critical importance right now, I think it's an interesting aspect to look at. Other aspects in terms of the domestic work sector, I think this market is going to continue. There's a lot of issues at the moment. I think I'll answer them I'm sure some of the audience will ask me a little bit more about the case of domestic workers. But I think for the domestic work, the demand is going to go up. The fertility rate here is still relatively high. You know, globally, the GDP per capita per employer is also very high. So their ability to hire is actually, because the salary here is $400 per month. I mean, I think there's one New York Times reporter asked me, so what about in Lebanon? It's like, most likely they're not going to hire because they ran out of cash. Well, I told this, you know, reporter that, okay, that's not in the case of the Gulf, because I think the wages are pretty much high. That's different dynamics. The third one is actually localization, right? Will it actually empower, you know, the Gulf states to enforce a much more tougher nationalization scheme? Well, if you look at the stimulus packages plans, the basic sort of, you know, goals of these economic stimulus package plans are 2 things. One, to protect the local workforce, meaning Gulf governments will pay the private sector to retain these local workers, or paid that certain percentage of wages so private sector will not terminate local population. So it's for the protection of local workers. The second one is actually economic relief, directly to help banks and the private sector, and which means in the case of UAE, for example, allowing migrant workers with debt to postpone it for 3 months or more, depending on their case. So will it trigger? Perhaps the numbers will go up, but it also depends on the number of migrants who will actually return back home. And for sure, there's a lot of them actually within the coming months. It may trigger because the Gulf states, they do protect the local workforce, specifically, their composition, right, and stability in the private sector. Sending states responsibilities, I think they're going to need to work a little bit harder in terms of integrating a crisis management approach. I mean, I understand like no states are actually prepared to deal with this. In the case of the Philippines, I mean, we had to deal with it in Libya, in Iraq, in Lebanon, but the state is actually not prepared to deal with this because the Philippine state is tied, domestically in the Philippines, we have about 100 million, 110 million Filipinos. So the state has to deal with the 100 million in the country, and then the 10, 11 million outside. So sending states like the Philippines, specifically those countries with very low fiscal budget, they're going to need to like really rethink and re-strategize how and where to invest a lot of their money, specifically in the context of, skills training, mutual recognition, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's an interesting aspect that that's going to unfold. And the last one, sorry, I'm taking a lot of your time, but the social protection actually, I think a lot of Gulf countries now are seeing the critical linkage between public health and migration. I do know it has been a priority before, and I think it will be an even more important priority because it's very difficult to achieve economic growth and sustainability without really addressing social protection, specifically in those migrant populations in high risk conditions. So Gulf states now are really realizing that. So the strategic investments and approaches that they're doing is pretty high actually in terms of domestic policy priority. And it's also raising a lot of foreign policy inquiries and issues for sending countries. I think I want to end this sort of note with the sending countries. So the challenge for sending countries at the moment is that, well, if you're going to repatriate these workers, the first question is, can you afford to repatriate these workers and who pays for it, right? And a lot of sending countries don't have that sufficient welfare fund. Before, high migrant workforce population is a good thing because it could bring in remittances, etc. Now it's actually a risk because a lot of these states are not receiving funds, from these intermediary financial institutions. So it's risky because no remittances, and now they are constitutionally responsible to repatriate these workers, which would mean they have to mobilize their domestic institutions in origin countries, meaning the infrastructure, quarantine spaces in thousands or perhaps in millions, nurses and doctors, and even the hotel spaces that they need to actually quarantine these spaces. So I think what I add is two quite quick examples. Tensions actually emerged between Gulf countries and Asian countries because of this repatriation arrangement. So in the case of UAE and India, UAE basically said, Indian nationals want to go home, and that the Indian government is responsible to repatriate these workers, specifically those stranded visa holders, because a lot of workers here, they arrive on a tourist visa and they ended up working. It's very much similar, I think, in the West. But the point that I'm making here is that the Indian government basically responded by saying, well, we do need some time, extra time. We can only do it next month because we also have thousands and thousands of migrant workers from other parts of the Middle East and Europe and Asia who also want to go home. And Indian government is basically saying, we can't do it. I think that created some tension, specifically when the UAE responded by saying that, it's not directed to India, but I think it's directed towards all sending countries, that any sending state that is resisting to, expedite the repatriation, process for their nationals, they would reconsider their, diplomatic relations specifically in the context of reducing the quotas, right, that workers would be allowed into the Gulf countries. Nepal is a different case because I think they are struggling more in terms of finances. It's a country that has faced so much financial difficulties over the past decade, and the state is quite struggling as well. The Philippines is a different case, actually. Workers actually don't want to leave. So I think I want to end this with this last point. So when the UAE government basically said, communicate with your embassies and let's facilitate your repatriation, those who are wishing to return, right? So Pakistanis, I think there's 40,000 of them, right, who signed up immediately. In the case of Indians, I think 50,000 or more. For Filipinos, I mean, less than 500. I mean, that could really tell you, who wants to stay and who wants to actually leave in the short run. And a lot of Filipinos, and I would presume a lot of migrant workers in the Gulf region, face the same difficulty in terms of balancing that cost and benefits. So it's a struggle for them. It's a struggle for sending states. And it's also a struggle for the Gulf states because now they have to factor in all these elements, protect the industries that they built because they didn't want to go back to 2008, where they also faced that crisis. So the question is that, how do you actually balance the social protection, for these migrants and, the protection for the local industry that is so essential, not just for the Gulf states, but also the migrants and sending states. So it's a big question. I think the real trigger here would be if COVID cases go up and up and up, I think that could really trigger the state to either push more direct, more restrictive policies. Like I think in the case of recently in Saudi, I think there was this alleged sort of statement where they deported workers from Ethiopia, 2,000 of them. So I think there's a lot of these actions, that will in particular unfold in the future. So I think it's very interesting to look at, within the next few months, how will Gulf states, right, respond to these, and how, will sending states increase their responses, be it in the fiscal policy aspect, be it in the social protection, and how migrant workers will be able to survive this. And for the most part, I'm pretty sure they will struggle a lot. That's why I think there's more assistance that need to be extended to them, specifically those undocumented migrant workers, specifically those undocumented migrant workers with children here. So I think that is going to be an interesting dynamic that I hope policymakers in the region would be able to unpack and coordinate with sending countries. So yeah.
Thank you
so much. I hope I answered that question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Froilan. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today and answering all these questions from all parts of the world. And for the audience, if you have any suggestions for global conversations, frontlines during COVID-19, please contact me. And otherwise, just tune in 14 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.